What if I told you, in a galaxy where every civilization bowed without question, one human refused? No weapons, no power, just something the universe had never seen before. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about defiance. It's about the moment control itself begins to break.
No one had ever resisted the crown. That was the first law of the assembly, older than the empires that now filled its endless tiers, older than the languages spoken across its chambers, older even than the stars that had burned out since its founding. When the royal heir lifted a hand, entire species bent, not out of loyalty, not out of fear, but because something inside their minds simply gave way. It was not a command. It was a certainty. Kneel, and they did as naturally as breathing. So when the pressure came down across the hall, silent and invisible, every delegate dropped at once. Scaled bodies folded against polished floors. Multi-limbed dignitaries collapsed into careful bows. Even the warbred species, creatures that had torn apart moons in their own systems, sank without resistance, their defiance dissolving into something softer, something obedient. The psychic field did not shout. It did not force. It simply rewrote the part of you that believed you had a choice. At the center of it all stood a human who did not kneel. For a moment, no one noticed. The assembly was too vast, too layered with spectacle, too accustomed to perfection. The air stood above them on a floating dais of white crystal, his presence radiating outward in waves that shimmered through the air like heat over glass. He was young by the standards of his kind, barely 17 cycles, but his mind carried the weight of generations that had never known defeat. When he spoke, it was with the casual certainty of someone who had never been questioned. "Observe," he said, his voice carrying without effort, touching every consciousness in the chamber. "This is what separates the worthy from the rest." The pressure deepened. It was not stronger. That was the strange part. Those who experienced it could not describe an increase in force, only a narrowing of possibility. Thought slowed. Resistance felt irrelevant. Kneeling became the only reasonable outcome. And still, at the center of that collapsing certainty, the human remained upright. Someone noticed. A ripple moved through the nearest tier, a flicker of confusion that broke the perfect symmetry of submission. A figure, small and unremarkable by galactic standards, stood alone among a sea of bowed forms. No armor. No visible augmentation. Just a young woman in a worn gray uniform, her hands hanging loosely at her sides as if she had forgotten what they were supposed to do. The heir's gaze shifted. It did not move quickly. It did not need to. Attention, once directed, arrived with total precision. The pressure in the chamber adjusted, not stronger, but sharper, like a lens focusing on a single point. "Human," he said, and the word carried something new now, something faintly curious beneath the amusement. "You misunderstand the demonstration." The woman tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something far away. "I understand," she replied. Her voice did not echo like his. It did not reach every mind at once. It traveled the old way, through air and distance, quiet enough that those closest had to strain to hear it. And yet the effect was immediate. Heads lifted. Not fully, not yet, but enough for doubt to enter. The air smiled. "Then you understand that you should be kneeling." The pause. Not hesitation. Not fear. Something else. The woman exhaled slowly, and for the first time, those watching noticed the details they had missed. The slight tremor in her fingers that never quite became weakness. The faint scars at the edge of her collar where something had once burned too close. The way her eyes did not fix on the air, but seemed to look through him, as if measuring distance in a way no one else could perceive. "I am," she said. The chamber stirred. Confusion spread faster than any command. Some thought it arrogance. Others thought madness. A few, the oldest among them, felt something colder, something that did not fit into any category they understood. The air's expression did not change, but the space around him tightened. "You stand?" he said. The woman nodded once, almost absently. "Where I come from," she replied. "This feels the same." No one spoke. The pressure did not lift, but something inside it cracked, not in force, but in meaning. The certainty that had governed every previous moment faltered, just enough to let a question through. The heir leaned forward slightly, interest sharpening into focus. "And where," he asked, "is that human?" For the first time, she looked directly at him. There was no challenge in her gaze. No anger. No visible defiance. Just something steady, something that did not shift under the weight pressing down on it. "Home," she said. "Before it broke." Silence fell, not the obedient quiet of submission, but something heavier, something filled with the sudden awareness that this moment was no longer following the rules it was supposed to follow. The heir studied her, and for the first time in his life, the outcome of a demonstration was not already decided. "Interesting," he murmured. Around them, bodies began to tremble, not from the pressure, but from the effort of holding on to a certainty that was starting to slip. The human did not move. And somewhere in the vast, ancient structure of the assembly, a question took root that had never existed before. What happens when the crown meets something it cannot rewrite? The pressure did not release, but it changed. Those who had spent their entire existence beneath the crown's influence could feel the shift immediately, even if they did not understand it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a note in a perfect harmony slipping just out of alignment. The command to kneel was still there, still absolute in its design, but something within it no longer resolved cleanly. For the first time, obedience felt negotiable. That alone was enough to disturb the assembly. Slowly, cautiously, the nearest delegates began to rise. Not fully, not with confidence, but enough to see. Enough to confirm what their instincts were already whispering was impossible. The human still stood at the center of the chamber, unchanged, untouched, as if the crown's will had simply passed through her without finding anything to hold. The heir watched this with a stillness that carried more weight than anger ever could. "Release," he said. The pressure vanished. It did not fade. It did not weaken. It simply ceased to exist as though it had never been there at all. Bodies straightened across the chamber, some with relief, others with unease. A few stepped back instinctively, as if distance alone could protect them from whatever had just happened. The human did neither. She remained exactly where she was, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, as if the absence of pressure was no more significant than its presence. That was the second anomaly. The air descended. The white crystal beneath his feet dissolved into motes of light, reforming step by step as he moved downward through the tiers of the assembly. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not meant to impress. It was simply how his kind moved when they chose to engage directly, effortless, precise, unquestioned. He stopped a short distance from her. Up close, the differences were more apparent. His form was flawless, every movement controlled to a degree that bordered on unnatural. Even his stillness felt deliberate, as if he had chosen the exact position that would best convey authority. The human, by contrast, seemed almost unfinished. Her posture shifted slightly with each breath. Her weight rested unevenly on one leg. There were imperfections in her stance that no advanced species would allow. And yet she had not knelt. "You will explain," he said. It was not a demand. It was an expectation. The human considered him for a moment, not with the deference the assembly expected, but with a kind of quiet evaluation that suggested she was deciding how much truth to give. "You think it's your power," she said finally. "But it's not." A murmur rippled outward. No one spoke to the crown like that. Not because it was forbidden, though it was, but because it had never been necessary. There had never been a circumstance in which such a statement could even be formed without collapsing under its own contradiction. The heir's expression remained unchanged. "Then enlighten me," he replied. She gestured faintly toward the space around them, toward the place where the pressure had been. "It works because most minds have somewhere to go," she said. "A place they retreat to when something stronger pushes in. You give them that direction. Kneel, and everything else becomes easier." The assembly listened. Not because they chose to, but because they could not stop. "And you?" the heir asked. Her eyes shifted, just slightly, not away from him, but inward, as if referencing something no one else could see. "There's nowhere for it to go," she said. The words landed without force, but their implications spread like a fracture through glass. No retreat. No safe space. No internal structure that could be redirected or overridden. The heir tilted his head, a gesture so small it would have gone unnoticed if not for what it represented. That is not a strength, he said. That is a defect. Maybe, she replied. But it works. A pause stretched between them. Around them, the assembly adjusted, recalibrating in real time. What had begun as a demonstration of dominance was becoming something else entirely, something unplanned, something without precedent. Delegates exchanged glances, silent communications passing between species that had once believed they understood the boundaries of power. At the highest tier, one of the elder judges leaned forward. Human, the judge said, their voice layered with multiple tones that resonated across different sensory ranges. State your designation. The woman's gaze flickered upward briefly, acknowledging the question. Marven, she said. The name meant nothing to most of those present. But not to all. A smaller cluster of delegates, those who monitored the outer systems, the unstable regions, the places where civilizations either hardened or broke, reacted almost imperceptibly. A shared recognition passed between them, followed by something that looked uncomfortably like caution. The heir noticed. Your origin? He asked. This time, the hesitation was real. It was brief, almost invisible, but it existed. Mara Ven, the judge repeated more firmly. You will answer. Mara exhaled slowly. Outer colony, she said. Designation Sol Fringe 7. The reaction was immediate. Not loud. Not dramatic. But unmistakable. Sol Fringe 7 was not a place that appeared in formal discussions. It was not cited in diplomatic records or referenced in the curated histories presented to the assembly. It existed at the edge of mapped space, in a region defined more by absence than by presence. Communications from that sector were irregular. Trade routes avoided it. The few reports that did surface were inconsistent, fragmented, and often dismissed as unreliable. It was, in every meaningful sense, a dead zone. The heir's eyes narrowed slightly. That system failed, he said. 2 cycles ago. Mara nodded. Yeah, she said. It did. Another pause. This one carried weight. And yet you stand here, he continued. Her expression did not change. Not all of it failed, she replied. The assembly felt it then. Not the crown's pressure. Something else. A shift in narrative, a subtle reorientation of expectation that no one had authorized and no one could fully control. The demonstration had been meant to prove a point about superiority. Instead, it was beginning to reveal a gap, small, but undeniable, between what the galaxy believed about humanity and what might actually be true. The heir straightened. Then we will correct that misunderstanding, he said. The crystal light returned beneath his feet, lifting him slightly above the chamber floor as he addressed the assembly once more. The anomaly will be tested, he announced. Publicly. Thoroughly. Without limitation. A ripple of anticipation spread. The trials. They were not spoken of lightly. They were not invoked without purpose. Designed in the earliest era of the assembly, they existed to answer one question and one question only. What is a species truly capable of when stripped of advantage? Most avoided them. Many failed. Some did not return at all. Mar did not look away. You don't have to do this, one of the human delegates called out from the lower tiers, their voice tight with something between fear and urgency. We came for negotiation, not. Mara raised a hand slightly. The delegate fell silent. It was not authority. It was something closer to trust. She looked back at the heir. Okay, she said. No hesitation. No conditions. Just acceptance. The heir smiled again, but this time there was no amusement in it. Good, he said. Then we begin with a simple question. The chamber darkened. Not physically, but perceptually, as the assembly systems shifted focus, isolating the central arena, preparing the first of the trials. Data streams activated. Environmental constructs initialized. Parameters began to form in layers of complexity that most present could barely follow. Mara remained where she was, watching, waiting. You claim your mind cannot be redirected, the heir continued, his voice now carrying the formal cadence of the trials. We will see if your body follows the same rules. A projection flared into existence between them. A world. Hostile. Unstable. Lethal in ways that required no explanation. Survive, he said. No further instructions. No tools specified. No time limit given. Just the task. Mara stepped forward, eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the projection. Around her, the assembly leaned in. Not to witness a failure, but to understand something they were no longer certain they had the right to dismiss. And as the parameters of the first trial locked into place, one question lingered, unanswered, pressing harder than any crown ever had. What exactly had survived on Soul Fringe 7, and what had it become?
So far, we have seen something impossible. The crown, an unstoppable force that bent entire species, failed against one human, Mara Wen. In front of entire assembly, she didn't just resist, she exposed a crack in their absolute control. Now we know she comes from Sol French 7, a system that was supposed to be dead, and yet she survived. But here's the real question: what kind of place creates someone like Mara, and what happens when that kind of human is pushed even further?
The world did not look survivable. That was the first conclusion every observer reached, regardless of species, regardless of experience. The projection hovering in the center of the assembly was not a simplified model or a theoretical construct. It was pulled from real data, raw, unfiltered, and deliberately unadjusted. The atmosphere churned in violent layers of chemical storms. Temperatures shifted in lethal extremes within minutes. The surface itself seemed unstable, tectonic fractures glowing faintly beneath clouds thick enough to swallow light. No stable water cycle. No breathable air. No ecological baseline. Nothing to work with. That system is uninhabitable, one of the senior delegates murmured, their voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest. Even automated probes fail within hours. That is the point, another replied. The heir said nothing. He did not need to. The parameters spoke clearly enough. This was not a test of endurance alone. It was a test of understanding, of whether the human's defiance was rooted in something real or simply an anomaly that would collapse under pressure. Mara studied the world in silence. She did not ask for clarification. She did not request tools or constraints. Her gaze moved across the projection slowly, deliberately, tracing patterns that most in the assembly did not yet see. Wind currents, chemical density shifts, the faint, almost invisible indicators of something beneath the chaos. You may begin, the heir said. The arena shifted. The projection expanded, surrounding her in a full sensory simulation that replicated not only the visual environment, but the physical experience of being within it. The air thickened instantly, heavy with compounds that would tear through unprotected lungs. The ground beneath her feet trembled, unstable, as if uncertain whether it intended to remain solid. Mara took one breath, then another. She did not reach for the standard equipment interface hovering at the edge of the simulation field. Every competitor in the trials was granted access to fabrication tools, environmental stabilizers, adaptive suits, technologies designed to level the playing field between species with vastly different capabilities. She ignored them. The assembly noticed. She is not activating protection, someone said, disbelief creeping into their tone. The atmospheric composition alone will kill her, another finished. Mara exhaled slowly, adjusting. The toxins in the air burned. Not immediately, not fatally, but enough to register. Enough to demand a response. Her body reacted the way all bodies did, heart rate rising, breathing tightening, instincts pushing toward escape. She did not leave. Instead, she crouched, placing one hand against the ground. The surface was warm, almost hot in places, heat radiating upward from the fractures below. The soil, or what passed for it, was not uniform. It shifted in texture and density, layers of particulate matter compressed under inconsistent pressure. It looked chaotic. It wasn't. Mara's fingers pressed slightly deeper, feeling resistance, then give, then resistance again. Interesting, she murmured. The word carried no triumph, no excitement, just recognition. Above her, the air watched closely. Explain, one of the judges requested. Mara did not look up. It's not random, she said. It just looks that way if you expect it to behave like a stable system. She stood, brushing her hand lightly against her uniform. Everyone keeps trying to remove the problem, she continued, gesturing faintly toward the churning atmosphere. Filter it. Neutralize it. Replace it with something safer. A flicker of activity appeared on the projection's edge, other species' previous attempts, archived for reference. Massive atmospheric processors. Energy shields. Chemical converters. Each one designed to impose order on the chaos. Because that is the correct approach, a delegate interjected. You cannot survive in an environment that actively destroys you. Mara tilted her head slightly. Depends on what you mean by survive. The pause. The air's gaze sharpened. Clarify. She stepped forward, deeper into the simulation, where the atmospheric density increased and visibility dropped. The air grew thicker, heavier, pressing against her lungs with each breath. Her movements slowed, not from hesitation, but from the simple physics of moving through resistance. You're all trying to make this place less hostile, she said. But that's not what it's built for. Built? Someone echoed. Mara nodded faintly. Systems like this don't exist by accident, she said. Not at this scale. There's a pattern underneath it. A cycle. She knelt again, this time closer to one of the glowing fractures. Heat surged upward, stronger here, carrying with it a different mix of compounds, less corrosive in some ways, more volatile in others. She extended her hand cautiously, letting the rising currents brush against her skin without fully exposing herself. The assembly leaned in. She is going to damage herself, a voice whispered. She already is, another replied. Mara's expression tightened slightly, a brief flicker of discomfort crossing her face. Then it was gone. There? She said quietly. On the projection, a series of data points highlighted automatically, the system responding to her focus. Chemical concentrations. Temperature gradients. Flow patterns that intersected in ways that were not immediately obvious unless you knew where to look. Everyone's been trying to stop the reactions, she continued. But the reactions are the only stable thing here. The statement hung in the air. Paradoxical. Uncomfortable. The air's fingers moved slightly, adjusting the simulation parameters, increasing the resolution of the data feed. Proceed, he said. Mara stood, turning slowly as she mapped the environment in her mind. On Earth, she said, we've got places like this. Not exactly the same, but close enough. Deep vents. Toxic lakes. Places where nothing should live. A few delegates shifted, recognizing the reference. They do not support complex life, one pointed out. They support life, Mara replied. Just not the kind you're used to. She walked toward the equipment interface again. For a moment, it looked like she might finally activate it. Instead, she reached past the advanced fabrication systems and selected the most basic option available, a simple container, a set of low-grade chemical tools, and a microscale environmental chamber. The assembly fell silent. That is insufficient, someone said flatly. Those tools cannot. They're not supposed to, Mara interrupted. She began working. Not with the precision of someone executing a known solution, but with the careful, iterative movements of someone testing a hypothesis in real time. She gathered samples, small, controlled amounts of atmospheric compounds, particulate matter, trace elements from the soil. She combined them, adjusted ratios, observed reactions. At first, nothing significant happened. Then something did. A minor shift. A slight change in coloration within the chamber. A reaction that did not escalate into instability, but instead settled. Mara leaned closer, eyes narrowing. Okay, she murmured. That's step one. Above her, the air watched the data stream update. The reaction was not powerful. It did not reshape the environment or neutralize the toxins. It did something else. It sustained itself. A low-level, continuous process that fed on the existing conditions instead of fighting them. The first judge leaned forward. "Is that intentional?" they asked. Mara didn't answer immediately. She was already moving to the next step, adjusting variables, building on the reaction instead of replacing it. "It's not about fixing the system," she said finally. "It's about giving it something new to do." The implications rippled outward. If the environment could be redirected instead of suppressed, if the chaos could be structured without being eliminated, then the entire premise of the trial, of most advanced solutions, was flawed. The heir's expression did not change. But something behind it did. "Continue," he said. Mara did. And as the first stable chain reaction began to form, small, fragile, but undeniably functional, the assembly felt the ground shift beneath assumptions that had held for centuries. The human wasn't surviving the environment. She was teaching it to change. And no one yet understood what that would lead to. The reaction should have failed. That was the first calculation running through every advanced system observing the trial. The chain Mara had initiated was too simple, too fragile, too dependent on unstable variables that no optimized solution would ever tolerate. By every known model, it should have collapsed within seconds under the volatility of the environment. It did not. Instead, it spread. Not dramatically. Not in a way that impressed the eye or triggered immediate alarm. It moved quietly, almost invisibly, extending its influence through the smallest available pathways. A shift in chemical balance here. A micro-adjustment in temperature there. Each change insignificant on its own, but together forming something the assembly had not seen before. Continuity. "She is not stabilizing the environment," one of the judges said slowly. "She is aligning with it." Mara did not respond. Her focus had narrowed, not outward toward the spectacle, but inward toward the process she had set in motion. She moved with increasing speed now, not frantic, but decisive, adjusting inputs as the reaction evolved. Each action built on the last, each choice reinforcing the system rather than replacing it. The heir watched in silence. His gaze moved not across the surface of the simulation, but through it, tracing the deeper patterns beneath the visible changes. He had expected resistance. He had prepared for defiance. What he had not accounted for was this: a solution that did not oppose his design, but bypassed it entirely. "Amplify environmental stress," he said. The command triggered instantly. The simulation responded with brutal efficiency. Atmospheric density spiked. Storm systems intensified, chemical reactions accelerating into dangerous extremes. The ground fractured more violently, releasing bursts of superheated gas that tore through the lower layers of the atmosphere. The chain reaction faltered. For a fraction of a second, it looked like the inevitable had finally arrived, that the fragile system Mara had built would collapse under pressure it was never meant to endure. Mara's head snapped up. Not in panic. In recognition. "So that's how you're playing it?" she murmured. The assembly shifted uneasily. The trials were meant to be difficult. They were not meant to be manipulated in real time to target a specific approach. There were rules, unspoken but understood, about maintaining the integrity of the test. The heir did not acknowledge the tension. "If your method is valid," he said calmly, "it will adapt." The implication was clear. If it could not, then it was never a method worth considering. Mara exhaled slowly, her eyes tracking the cascading failures beginning to ripple through her system. The delicate balance she had established was breaking apart, each component destabilizing under the increased volatility. Most competitors would have abandoned it. Reset. Switch to a more aggressive solution. Mara did not. Instead, she did something that made no sense to anyone watching. She removed part of her own system. A section of the chain she had built, carefully constructed, painstakingly stabilized, was dismantled in seconds, its components redirected into the surrounding environment rather than preserved. A gasp rippled through the assembly. "She is destroying her own progress," a delegate whispered. "No," another replied, voice tight with confusion. "She is feeding it." The heir leaned forward slightly. For the first time since the trial began, his attention sharpened into something more focused than curiosity. Mara worked faster now, not trying to hold the system together, but letting parts of it break in controlled ways. Each collapse released energy, compounds, interactions that did not dissipate into chaos, but were absorbed into the larger pattern she was guiding. "You're pushing it to fail," she said quietly, more to herself than to the air. "So let it fail." The storm systems above intensified again, lightning-like discharges tearing through the thick clouds. The ground split wider, heat surging upward in violent pulses that would have destroyed any rigid structure. But Mara's system was no longer rigid. It bent, it broke, and each break became part of something larger. Data streams across the assembly began to shift in ways that had not been predicted. The reaction was no longer confined to the initial chamber. It had spread beyond it, integrating with the environment instead of standing apart from it. "Impossible," one of the observers said under their breath. "It should not scale like this." "It shouldn't," another agreed. "Unless it was never meant to be contained." The heir's expression remained composed. But his control over the trial was slipping in a way that had nothing to do with authority. Mara stepped back, watching the system evolve without direct input for the first time since she had begun. Her breathing was heavier now, the strain of the environment and the intensity of her focus beginning to show. "Okay," she said softly. "Now we see what it does." The reaction accelerated. Not explosively. Not destructively. Efficiently. The toxic compounds in the atmosphere were no longer simply present. They were being processed, redirected through the chain Mara had created. Heat surges that had once destabilized the system were now driving it forward, providing the energy needed to sustain the reactions at a larger scale. It was not clean. It was not controlled. But it worked. And more importantly, it kept working without her. The assembly fell silent as the implications settled in. This was not a solution that required constant input, massive energy reserves, or advanced oversight. It was something else entirely. A system that used the environment's hostility as fuel, turning the very conditions that made survival impossible into the mechanism that made it sustainable. "She has created a self-sustaining adaptation loop," one of the judges said, their voice edged with disbelief. "Without advanced infrastructure. Without control," another added. The distinction mattered, because control was what the galaxy understood. This was something different. The heir finally moved. Not physically, but through the system itself, his influence threading into the simulation at a deeper level. The parameters shifted again, not just increasing stress, but altering the underlying variables, introducing inconsistencies, unpredictable fluctuations designed to disrupt any pattern that relied on stability. Mara felt it immediately. Her eyes narrowed, tracking the changes as they rippled through the system she had built. "That's new," she said. The reaction stuttered. For the first time since it had begun to scale, the chain faltered in a way that was not easily corrected. The variables no longer aligned cleanly. The environment itself was shifting too quickly, too unpredictably for the system to maintain coherence. Mara's jaw tightened. This wasn't just pressure anymore. This was interference. Above her, the heir's voice cut through the chamber. "Adapt," he said. "Not a challenge. A demand." Mara stared at the collapsing edges of her system, the parts that were no longer responding the way they should. Then, slowly, something in her expression changed. Not frustration. Not fear. Recognition. "You don't want it to survive," she said quietly. The heir did not respond. He did not need to. Mara nodded once, as if confirming something she had only just understood. "Okay," she said. Her gaze shifted, not to the system she had built, but beyond it, to the deeper layers of the simulation, the structures beneath the environment itself. "If the system can't hold," she murmured, "then maybe the system isn't the point." The assembly leaned forward as one. Because in that moment, it became clear that the trial was no longer about whether Mara could survive the environment. It was about whether she was about to change the rules of what survival even meant. And no one, least of all the heir, knew what she would try next. The system was never meant to work. That realization did not arrive as a sudden shock. It unfolded inside Mara with quiet precision, like a pattern finally aligning after too many inconsistencies to ignore. Every variable the air had introduced, every fluctuation beneath the surface of the simulation, pointed toward the same conclusion. This wasn't a hostile world. It was a controlled failure. Mara straightened slowly, her attention no longer fixed on the chain reaction she had built, but on the deeper architecture of the trial itself. The environment still raged around her, storms tearing through the simulated sky, chemical currents shifting unpredictably, tectonic fractures pulsing with unstable heat. But now she wasn't looking at what it was doing. She was looking at why. Above her, the assembly watched the data streams flicker with increasing instability. "She is losing coherence," one of the observers noted. "The system is collapsing." "It should have collapsed already," another replied. "Something else is interfering." The air remained still, his presence threaded through the simulation in ways most could not perceive. To them, the environment looked chaotic. To him, it was precise, each disruption carefully calculated, each variable adjusted to ensure one outcome. Failure. Mara exhaled slowly. "You built it to break," she said. Her voice carried just enough to be heard beyond the simulation field, cutting through the layered noise of the assembly. A ripple moved through the chamber. The air's gaze settled on her, expression unchanged. "All systems break," he replied. "That is the nature of imperfect design." Mara shook her head faintly. "No," she said. "This one breaks on purpose." Silence followed. Not immediate, not absolute, but spreading, growing as the implication took hold. The trials were meant to test capability, not enforce outcomes. They were designed to reveal limits, not create them. "If the parameters are biased," one of the judges began. "They are not," the air interrupted smoothly. "The environment behaves within acceptable variance." "That's not what I meant," Mara said. She stepped forward, deeper into the simulation, ignoring the way the air clawed at her lungs, the way the ground shifted beneath her feet. The chain reaction she had built was still active, still adapting, but she was no longer guiding it. It continued on its own, evolving in response to the environment even as parts of it failed. "That's the problem," she continued. "It's all within variance." The air's eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain." Mara gestured toward the storm systems above, the fractures below, the chemical surges that define the world. "Everything here looks unpredictable," she said. "But it's not. It's constrained. Every change stays inside a certain range, no matter how extreme it gets." She paused, letting that settle. "You're not testing survival," she said. "You're testing how long something can last before it hits the edges you've already decided on." The assembly shifted again, unease deepening into something sharper. "That is the purpose of a controlled trial," a delegate argued. "Without limits, results cannot be measured." Mara glanced up briefly. "Yeah," she said. "Measured." Then she looked back at the simulation. "But not solved." The word hung there. Solved. Not endured. Not survived. Solved. The air's expression remained composed, but something in the space around him tightened. "You misunderstand the nature of the trials," he said. "They are not puzzles to be solved. They are standards to be met." Mara smiled faintly. "On my world," she said, "those are the same thing." Before anyone could respond, she moved. Not toward the interface. Not toward the failing edges of her system. She stepped directly into one of the fractures. Gas surged upward in a violent burst, heat and toxins mixing in a wave that should have forced her back instantly. The assembly reacted with a collective intake of breath, some delegates rising halfway from their positions in instinctive alarm. "She will be killed," someone said. Mara didn't stop. She moved deeper into the fracture's influence, into the place where the environmental variables spiked beyond what any stable solution could handle. The data streams flared, warnings cascading across the system as the simulation registered conditions outside safe operational thresholds. The air's voice cut through the rising tension. "Withdraw," he said. It was the first direct command he had given her. Mara didn't obey. Instead, she knelt. Her hand pressed against the fractured surface again, but this time she wasn't searching for patterns in the existing system. She was looking for the boundaries, the invisible limits that defined how far the simulation could push before it corrected itself. A fluctuation that didn't align. A spike that didn't match the surrounding data. A seam. Her eyes narrowed. "Found you," she whispered. The assembly leaned forward as one. "What is she doing?" a judge asked, their voice carrying a rare edge of urgency. "She is exceeding safe interaction parameters," another replied. "If she destabilizes the simulation..." "She won't," Mara said. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. "This thing corrects itself before it can collapse," she continued. "That's how you keep it inside the range. You don't let it go far enough to break completely." The air's silence was no longer neutral. It was focused. "And you intend to change that?" he asked. Mara's fingers tightened slightly against the surface. "Yeah," she said. "I do." She moved quickly now, not building a system, but dismantling assumptions. The reaction she had created earlier was still running, still adapting, but she began redirecting it, not to stabilize the environment, but to push it harder, faster, toward the edges she had identified. The data stream spiked. Warning indicators flared. "This is outside trial parameters," one of the judges said sharply. "The subject is no longer attempting to survive. She is attempting to alter the environment itself," another finished, voice low with realization. The air stepped forward slightly, his presence pressing against the simulation in a way that made the air itself feel tighter. "Stop," he said. This time, it was not a suggestion. Mara looked up. For the first time since the trial began, there was something like intensity in her expression. Not anger, not defiance, but certainty. "You didn't want a solution," she said. "You wanted proof that we'd fail." The words landed harder than any force. A ripple of reaction moved through the assembly, not loud, but deep. Delegates exchanged glances, calculations shifting, assumptions fracturing under the weight of what they were seeing. The air's gaze did not waver. "And if I did?" he asked. Mara smiled again. Not wide. Not triumphant. Just enough. "Then you built the wrong test." She pressed her hand down. The reaction surged. Not outward. Downward. Into the seam. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the simulation hesitated. It was subtle. Almost imperceptible. But to those watching closely, it was unmistakable. The environment did not correct. It did not adjust. It stalled. The assembly went completely still. Because for the first time since the trial began, since the system had been activated, since the parameters had locked into place, the world inside the simulation was no longer behaving the way it was supposed to. The air's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. And as the seam began to widen, as the controlled failure of the environment threatened to become something uncontrolled, a new question tore through the chamber, sharper and more dangerous than anything before. What happens when the test itself starts to break?
This is where everything changes. Mara Chan didn't just survive the trial, she started rewriting it. The alien air tried to push her to failure, amplifying the environment, breaking her system. But instead, she adapted in ways they couldn't predict. She stopped fighting the chaos and started using it. And now, she's found something deeper, a flaw, a hidden seam in the system itself. The trial isn't just a test anymore, it's breaking. And if the system breaks, what else has been a lie?
The system did not recognize what was happening. That was the first anomaly. Every layer of the trial, every safeguard, every corrective protocol, every boundary condition designed to contain instability began firing at once. The simulation attempted to rebalance, to restore the environmental variables to acceptable ranges, to reassert control over the fracture Mara had exposed. It failed. Not completely. Not catastrophically. But enough. The seam did not close. Instead, it widened, slowly at first, then with increasing insistence, as if something beneath the simulation had been waiting for pressure to build before pushing back. The environment stuttered, its reactions losing synchronization. Storm systems misaligned. Chemical surges collided in ways they were never meant to. Heat spikes no longer dispersed cleanly through the atmosphere. For the first time, the world inside the trial looked uncertain. "Terminate the sequence," one of the judges said sharply. "The subject has exceeded permissible interaction." "No," another judge interrupted, voice lower, more controlled. "Not yet." Because they could see it. This was no longer a failure of survival. It was a failure of design. Mara remained at the center of it, one hand still pressed against the fracture, her body braced against forces that were no longer following predictable patterns. The air around her shifted erratically, bursts of toxic gas followed by sudden pockets of near clarity, as if the simulation could not decide what state it was supposed to maintain. Her breathing was heavier now. Not from fear. From strain. This was no longer adaptation. This was pressure. Above her the air moved. Not physically at first, but through the system itself, his influence threading deeper, overriding layers of control that no participant should have been able to access. The simulation responded to him instantly, its architecture bending around his will, trying to reassert the order that Mara had disrupted. "You are outside the trial," he said. His voice carried differently now, not just through the chamber, but through the simulation itself, resonating in the air, the ground, the very structure of the environment. "Return to the parameters," he commanded. Mara looked up. For a moment, the chaos around her seemed to pause, not because it had stabilized, but because her focus had shifted. "You keep saying that," she replied. "Like the parameters matter." "They define the outcome," the air said. Mara shook her head slightly. "They define the limits," she corrected. "Same thing, if you don't know how to break them." The seam pulsed beneath her hand. Not violently. Deliberately. The reaction she had redirected continued to feed into it, no longer trying to stabilize the environment, but pushing against the boundaries that held it in place. Each cycle of the chain added pressure. Not explosive, not uncontrolled, but persistent, cumulative. The kind of pressure that didn't stop. Containment failure at 32%, one of the system monitors announced, their voice tight with disbelief. "Correction protocols are not engaging." "They are engaging," another replied, eyes fixed on the data. "They are just not succeeding." The assembly shifted uneasily. This was not supposed to happen. The trials were built on certainty. On repeatability. On the assumption that no matter how advanced a participant's approach, the system itself would always remain in control. That assumption was breaking. The air stepped forward physically now, descending once more into the chamber, his presence pressing against the simulation with far greater force than before. The air around him stabilized instantly, the chaos retreating just enough to acknowledge his influence. "You misunderstand your position," he said, his voice colder now, stripped of the earlier curiosity. "You are not here to change the trial. You are here to be measured by it." Mara met his gaze. "Measured against what?" she asked. "Against the standard," he replied. She smiled faintly. "That's the problem," she said. "Your standard assumes the system is right." The seam widened again. This time, it was visible. Not just in the data streams, not just in the subtle misalignments of the environment, but in the simulation itself. A faint distortion, like a crack in glass that shouldn't exist in something designed to be seamless. The assembly reacted instantly. "That is a structural breach," a judge said, rising from their position. "If the simulation collapses—" "It won't collapse," Mara said. She sounded certain. Not hopeful. Not guessing. Certain. "Why?" the air demanded. Mara shifted her weight slightly, her stance adjusting to the new instability beneath her feet. "Because it doesn't know how," she said. The words landed harder than they should have. Systems did not need to know anything. They operated on rules, on logic, on parameters defined by their creators. Unless those rules had blind spots. The air's expression tightened, just slightly. "Everything fails," he said. "Given enough pressure." Mara nodded. "Yeah," she said. "But not everything fails the same way." She lifted her hand from the fracture. For a brief, dangerous moment, it looked like she might step back, that she might let the system correct itself now that the pressure had been applied. Instead, she did the opposite. She stepped deeper into the seam. The distortion flared, reacting to her presence in a way the simulation had not accounted for. The environmental variables spiked, then dropped, then spiked again, oscillating between states that should not have coexisted. "Mara, withdraw," the human delegate shouted from the lower tiers, their voice breaking through the controlled tension of the chamber. "You've proven enough. This isn't what we came here for." Mara didn't look back. "Almost," she said quietly. To them. To herself. To something else. The air moved faster now, his influence surging through the system in an attempt to reassert control, to force the simulation back into alignment before the breach could expand any further. But the more he pushed, the more resistance he encountered. Not from Mara. From the system itself. "It's feeding on the corrections," one of the observers said, voice edged with realization. "Every attempt to stabilize it is adding to the instability." The implication hit like a shockwave. The system was amplifying its own failure. Mara closed her eyes briefly. Not in surrender. In focus. "When things get bad enough," she said softly, "you stop trying to hold them together." The air's gaze locked onto her. "What do you do instead?" he asked. Mara opened her eyes. And for the first time, there was something unmistakable in them. Not just defiance. Not just determination. Something deeper. "You let them break," she said. She moved. Not with hesitation. Not with caution. With intent. Her hand came down again. Not on the surface of the fracture, but into it, pushing past the visible distortion into the underlying structure of the simulation itself. The data streams exploded into chaos. Warning signals cascaded across every system. Containment failure at 60%. Core parameters destabilizing. Override protocols unresponsive. The assembly erupted into motion, delegates rising, voices overlapping, systems attempting to regain control of a situation that was no longer contained within the bounds they understood. At the center of it all, Mara stood inside the breaking point of the trial. And for the first time since the crown had ever been used, since the assembly had ever existed, since the trials had ever been designed, the system was no longer in control of itself. The air stared at her, something new finally surfacing beneath his composure. Not anger. Not authority. Something far more dangerous. Uncertainty. And as the seams split wider, as the simulation teetered on the edge of something it had never been allowed to become, one question rose above the chaos, louder than any command, sharper than any pressure. If the system breaks completely, what does it reveal underneath? The system did not collapse. That was the second anomaly. Every projection in the assembly had predicted total failure once the breach exceeded critical thresholds. The simulation should have unraveled, its layers fragmenting into unusable data, the trial terminating automatically to preserve core integrity. That was how it had always worked. That was how it was designed to work. Instead, it held. Barely. Unsteadily. But it held. The distortion spreading from the seam no longer behaved like damage. It moved with a strange, uneven rhythm, as if the simulation was trying to understand what it was experiencing in real time. Environmental variables no longer corrected themselves immediately. Some stabilized. Others spiraled. A few did something entirely new, settling into states that had never been part of the original parameters. "Why is it not terminating?" one of the judges demanded, their voice cutting through the rising noise. "Fail-safe protocols are active," a system monitor replied, confusion bleeding through their normally controlled tone. "But they are waiting." Waiting for what? No answer came. At the center of the breach, Mara stood inside the distortion. From the outside, it looked like she was being consumed, her form partially obscured by the fractured layers of the simulation, her outline flickering as the system struggled to reconcile her position with its own structure. But from within, the experience was different. There was no chaos here. There was pressure. Memory-like, but not her own. Fragments of data flowed around her, not as images or sounds, but as patterns, rules, corrections, constraints layered on top of one another in ways that had never been meant to be seen directly. The trial was not just an environment. It was a construct built on assumptions so deeply embedded that no participant had ever been expected to question them. Until now. Mara reached out, not physically, but conceptually, the same way she had when she first identified the seam. Her awareness brushed against the underlying structure, and for a brief moment, something responded. Not the system. Something beneath it. She inhaled sharply. Above her, the air felt it too. Not through the simulation. Through the crown. A faint disruption, like static bleeding into a signal that had always been perfectly clear. It wasn't strong. It wasn't overwhelming. But it was there, threading through the mental space he had always controlled without resistance. His expression tightened. "What are you doing?" he asked. For the first time, there was no command in his voice. Just a question. Mara didn't answer immediately. She was listening. Not to the assembly, not to the simulation, but to the pattern beneath both. A structure that had been hidden under layers of controlled behavior, revealed only because the system had been pushed beyond its intended limits. "It's not broken," she said slowly. The words echoed strangely, as if the simulation itself was uncertain how to carry them. "It's suppressed." The assembly went still. "That is not possible," one of the judges said, but the certainty in their tone had weakened. "The trial systems are fully mapped and understood." "No," Mara interrupted quietly. "They're controlled." She turned slightly, her gaze unfocused, tracking something no one else could see. "There's a difference." The heir stepped forward, closer to the breach, his presence pressing against it in an attempt to reassert dominance, not just over the simulation, but over whatever was beginning to emerge from it. "Clarify," he said. Mara's expression shifted. Not outwardly. Internally. A recognition forming. Something aligning between what she was seeing now and something she had experienced before. "You've been doing this for a long time," she said. "Running these trials. Testing species. Measuring them against your standards." "That is the purpose of the assembly," the heir replied. Mara nodded faintly. "Yeah," she said. "But this," she gestured toward the fractured simulation around her, "this wasn't built just for testing." The pause. "It was built to filter." The word landed like a fracture through the chamber. "Filter what?" a delegate demanded. Mara's gaze shifted upward, locking onto the air. "Anything that doesn't behave the way you expect it to." Silence. Not the controlled quiet of authority. The heavy, uncertain silence of something fundamental being questioned. "That is speculation," the heir said, but the smooth certainty of his tone had begun to crack. "Unsupported by..." "You've never had a problem with the crown before, right?" Mara cut in. The question was simple, direct, and dangerous. The heir's eyes narrowed. "No species has resisted it," he said. Mara nodded again. "Exactly." She stepped further into the breach. The distortion flared, reacting more violently now, but not in rejection, in recognition. The patterns flowing around her shifted, aligning with her presence in ways that defied the system's original design. "Because everything you've tested so far fits inside the same kind of structure," she continued. "Predictable responses. Defined limits. Minds that work a certain way." Her voice steadied, growing clearer as the realization fully formed. "But what happens when something doesn't?" The crown pulsed. Not outward. Inward. The air felt it, an echo of the same disruption Mara had sensed earlier, but stronger now, threading through his connection to the system, to the assembly, to the inherited structure of control that had defined his species for generations. "This is irrelevant," he said, more sharply now. "The trial is..." "Not the point," Mara finished. She looked around, not at the chaos of the environment, but at the deeper layers now visible through the fracture. Structures that had never been meant to be seen. Constraints that had never been meant to be questioned. "You didn't design this to see what species can do," she said. "You designed it to make sure they don't go beyond what you can control." The assembly reacted instantly. Voices rose. Delegates shifted. Systems began cross-referencing data, searching for confirmation or contradiction. The idea itself was destabilizing. If the trials were not neutral, if they were biased toward maintaining a certain kind of order, then every result, every judgment, every decision made based on them was incomplete. The heir stepped closer to the edge of the breach. "You are extrapolating from insufficient data," he said, but now there was strain beneath the words. "You cannot." Mara looked directly at him. And this time, there was no softness in her expression. "No," she said. "I can." The crown pulsed again. Harder. The disruption spread. Not through the simulation. Through him. Memories flickered, brief, disjointed, but undeniable. Moments of instruction, of training, of reinforcement. Not just how to use the crown, but how to think with it, how to interpret resistance, how to categorize deviation. For the first time, those memories did not align perfectly. For the first time, there was a gap. The heir staggered slightly, not physically but mentally, his connection to the system wavering just enough to be felt. The assembly saw it. And that changed everything. Mara stepped forward one last time, fully into the center of the breach. The distortion surged around her, the simulation reaching a critical threshold where it could no longer maintain its original form. The environment flickered between states, reality and construct overlapping in unstable layers. "You wanted to measure us," she said. Her voice carried clearly now, cutting through the noise, through the instability, through the rising tension of a system on the edge. "But you never asked the right question." The heir looked at her, something unguarded finally breaking through his composure. "And what question is that?" he demanded. Mara held his gaze. And in that moment, the entire assembly felt the shift, not just in the simulation, not just in the crown, but in the narrative that had defined their understanding of power for generations. "What happens," she said quietly, "when the thing you're trying to control is the only thing that knows how to survive outside your system?" The breach expanded. The system faltered. And the trial, no longer contained, no longer predictable, no longer under anyone's control, reached the edge of something it had never been allowed to become. And no one was ready for what it was about to show. The system stopped trying to correct itself. That was the moment everything changed. Not collapsed. Not failed. Not shut down. It simply stopped resisting. Across the assembly, every monitoring interface froze for a fraction of a second, then recalibrated into something no one had ever seen before. The simulation did not return to its original state. It did not stabilize into a controlled environment. It opened. Layers that had always been hidden beneath operational parameters became visible not as data points, but as structure, raw, unfiltered architecture that revealed how the trial had always functioned. Not a test of capability. Not a neutral measurement. A filter. The realization hit the assembly all at once. Every past trial, every recorded failure, every species that had been judged unfit or unstable had not simply fallen short of a standard. They had collided with a boundary they were never meant to cross. And anything that pushed too close to it had been corrected or erased. Mara stood at the center of that revelation. The distortion around her no longer looked violent. It had smoothed into something almost quiet. The chaotic environment still existed, but it no longer defined the space. It had become part of a larger system, one that was no longer being suppressed. "You see it now," she said. Her voice carried without amplification, without force, yet it reached every corner of the chamber. The heir did not answer. He couldn't, because for the first time in his life, the crown was not guiding his thoughts. It was struggling to keep up with them. Fragments of memory surfaced again, but now they came without alignment. Training that had once felt absolute now revealed gaps. Instructions that had once seemed complete now showed omissions. Entire sections of inherited knowledge, entire assumptions about how the galaxy worked, no longer fit together cleanly. This was never about strength, Mara continued. It was about predictability. The assembly reacted, not with noise, but with stillness. The kind that comes when something too large to ignore finally settles into place. "You let species grow," she said. "Advance. Compete. But only inside the range you can understand. Inside the patterns you can control." She gestured around her, to the exposed structure beneath the simulation. "And anything that doesn't fit that pattern," she added quietly, never makes it this far. A low murmur spread through the upper tiers. Not outrage. Recognition. Because they could see it now, not just in the data, not just in the exposed systems, but in their own histories. The gaps. The unexplained disappearances. The civilizations that had risen too quickly, adapted too differently, and then vanished from the record. The heir took a step back. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was the first time he had ever moved without intention. That is not, he began, then stopped. The certainty was gone. Not replaced. Just absent. Mara watched him, not with triumph, not with anger, but with something quieter. Understanding. You didn't build it, she said. The statement landed softly. But it carried more weight than any accusation. The heir's eyes lifted to meet hers. What? He asked. You inherited it, she said. The system. The crown. The rules. You didn't question them because they always worked. She took a slow step forward, the distortion parting around her instead of resisting. But they only worked because no one ever pushed far enough to see what was underneath. The assembly felt it then, not just as a realization, but as a shift. Power, as they had understood it, had always been vertical. Controlled. Directed. Measured from the top down. The crown reinforced that structure, ensuring that no deviation could ever fully break through. Until now. The heir looked down at his hand. For the first time, the connection felt unstable. Not weak. Not gone. Just incomplete. What are you? He asked. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't even a challenge. It was the first real question he had ever asked without already knowing the answer. Mara considered it. Not for long. Nothing special, she said. The assembly stirred. That wasn't the answer they expected. She gestured faintly toward the fracture, toward the exposed system, toward everything that had been hidden until this moment. Just from a place where things break all the time, she continued. Where systems fail. Where rules stop working. Her gaze returned to him. And you either learn to adapt, or you don't survive. Silence. Heavy. Final. The heir's posture shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would have registered as submission in any formal sense, but in something deeper. The rigid certainty that had defined every movement, every word, every thought he had ever expressed, loosened. He looked at the system again. At the exposed structure. At the truth that had been buried beneath layers of control. Then back at her. And slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head. The assembly reacted, not with shock, but with something far more profound. A recalibration. Because this wasn't defeat. It was acknowledgement. The crown did not activate. It did not compel the gesture. It did not define it. For the first time, the motion belonged entirely to him. I was wrong, he said. The words were quiet, but they carried farther than any command ever had. Mara didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The system was already changing. Not collapsing. Not being destroyed. But opening. Its boundaries no longer absolute. Its purpose no longer singular. The trial would not return to what it had been. It couldn't. Too much had been revealed. Too many assumptions had been broken. Across the assembly, delegates began to move, not in unison, not under command, but independently. Conversations started. Systems updated. Records re-examined. The structure that had defined galactic order for generations was shifting in real time. And at the center of it all, a human stood in a place that had never been meant for someone like her. What happens now? The heir asked. Mara looked around. At the assembly. At the system. At the fracture that had become something else entirely. Then back at him. That depends, she said, on whether you keep trying to control everything. The pause. Just long enough for the question to settle. Or finally learn how to survive it. The words lingered. Not as an answer. As an opening. Because the trial wasn't over. It had just become something no one had ever prepared for. And somewhere beyond the assembly, beyond the systems they thought they understood, beyond the boundaries they had spent centuries enforcing, there were more fractures.
In the end, this was never about strength. It was about control. The crown didn't dominate because it was powerful, it dominated because everything it faced was predictable. But humanity does not just survive systems, it breaks them, learns from them, and evolves beyond them. Maravan didn't defeat the assembly, she revealed the truth that their entire system was built to filter out anything they couldn't control. And now the galaxy has a new reality to face. Because if one human could break the system, how many more are out there? Thank you.